Hello, everyone. Welcome to New Polity Podcast, our series, Politics of Paganism. I'm Alex Denley, here with Dr. Andrew Jones.
Hello.
So we're on Thomas Aquinas now, so the Treatise on Law. So last episode, we dealt with the pagan cosmos, or the idea of the closed world. That what we found going through Plato and Aristotle is that there's this tension, we could say, between the transcendence and the immanent, between relative and absolute justice. And that in moments in which it seems as though Plato and Aristotle are breaking through, let's say, are in the analogy of the cave, that they're helping us to leave the cave, see further, that there's always the potential that it gets reeled in back into the existing regime. We're talking about politics.
Right. Yeah. That you're never sure you're really out of the cave. You may just be in a higher cavern.
Right. Yeah.
And there's no ground on which to assert you're not.
Yeah, and with the regime forms that comes to bear, because both Plato and Aristotle show us how each of the regimes kind of start in a grand aristocratic, fashion, and then quickly proceed down the cycles of regime forms.
Right.
And what you were describing last time with Hobbes and the Leviathan is that what we have in the pagan world, because it's closed down, is a physics of power. I think you described it that way.
Right.
Where if some part of the city isn't the most powerful, something else will rise. And that so power is total. It's all human. Everyone's fighting against everyone. Like Hobbes says. And now we're making the transition to the Christian.
Right.
Now we're making the transition to how does Thomas pick up on a lot of those problems in the Treatise on Law, pick up on a lot of the movements towards the transcendence, or the movements to anticipating, we could say, the divine law, or the God entering the scene. And really, this podcast is trying to understand what does Thomas think about law? What does Thomas think about power? And how does this reveal to us the Christian political order?
Right. Yeah, and I think one place to begin would be just the observation that Christianity, as read through the tradition, so Thomas being a sort of exemplary example of the tradition, and maybe the most sort of thought through and thorough, that Christianity is not a repudiation of politics. It's not a sort of quietist, passive, like, just let the world go by and we'll just be at peace and die and go to heaven. It's not a rejection of the political problem as the ancients understood it and came to see it and see the problem. That's not what it is. And that it maybe has become that way in certain strands of Christianity, especially in modernity, but that Christianity, in the traditional Christianity, faces the political problem squares up to it, and offers a way of understanding it, but even beyond understanding it, of living, a way of living at a reality of human life that perceives and surpasses, moves past those pagan problems. Right, and this is what we're going to try to do. It's very complicated and very foreign to a lot of us. Right? I mean, it can take a long time to kind of wrap your head around the Christian argument here, because it's not simple. It's incredibly complex.
Maybe I could begin then with what Aquinas picks up Aristotle's insight about the perfect community. So, and this maybe illustrates what we're saying about power, that that law has the care of the common good, and that the political community is a perfect or complete community, that there are power relations all the way through.
This is the Aristotelian.
The Aristotelian
understanding.
And Aquinas is picking that up, that he also, when he defines law, he says it's an ordinance of reason, and it's to bring acts to their fulfillment. It's to bring people to an end. But by picking up the Aristotelian, he's saying there's not like an outside to law or an outside to power.
Aristotle's saying that.
Yes.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's right. So one of the ways maybe that's important is, okay, when Aristotle talks about politics as the architectonic science, the science which orders all other acts towards the final end, which he views as happiness, but which he views happiness as that which is achievable within the political. So if happiness is the final end and happiness is something that is achieved within the city, then politics in the Aristotelian sense is the architectonic science. It's the highest science. But the problem is, if you pick up Aristotle's argument there and then go, but happiness is not achievable in the city in a self-sufficient manner, but happiness is rather beatitude. All right, so man's end is not merely political. Man's end is now supernatural. So man's end surpasses the political. It moves past it. Now the architectonic science then becomes the science which orders everything towards that supernatural end, not the natural end. So we can no longer, now, what does that do to politics? Can we now talk about politics as the architectonic science? It's like, well, sort of, if what we now mean is that the supernatural end, or this final end that we are ordered towards, is always achieved through the political, right? So we don't sidestep the political, we move in it and through it towards the final end. It's the only way that it is achieved as a social entity, as a social being. But it's if we talk about politics as the architectonic science, if that's going to be our like basic definition, then the highest form of politics then is going to be theological, right? It's no longer this merely human. And so when Christians make a mistake then when they take Aristotle's definition of politics and then when they are now going to be Christians, don't then move that highest science into a theological science, right? They can't still maintain that politics is the architectonic science in the way in which Aristotle did, based on Aristotle's own definition, right? If they believe, as Christians do, that the final end is not on this earth, is not in this world, but is rather surpassing it or transcendent to it. Right? So there's an initial move there that makes us consider politics in a completely different frame.
Yes, right. Because God is the one who is ultimately bringing man to his fulfillment, and therefore the city is not the final end.
The final end. It's funny because it's like, well, is the final end achievable within the city? It's like, well, happiness, to the extent that it's achievable on earth, is achievable within the city, theoretically. I mean, sin compromises this, but let's just set that aside for a second. Theoretically. But it's not achievable within the resources that the city itself brings to bear, right? Like it's no longer, so the self-sufficient thing is not the city. The self-sufficient thing is the cosmos as a whole, being led, being governed by the perfect statesman, God himself. All right, so the common good or the self-sufficient thing is the idea of a city as being self-sufficient is completely exploded.
Oh, wow.
Right. That doesn't mean it's not a perfect community in the sense that if human beings achieve their perfection or achieving their perfection, what does the human community within that perfection, what is its final form? Well, it may very well be a sort of just city, a sort of just polity of that sort. And so then there's you see that there can be a perfection in the city as the perfect community in the human sense of this is the perfect human participation in which is really the perfect self-sufficient community, which is the cosmos as a whole.
Right. It's participating in something grander
than that. It's not the end or the terminus. It doesn't the dynamic doesn't stop with the city. The city is a piece within the whole.
Yeah, and it's a problem if it stops with the city, right? Like
that's the problem we're talking about. Yeah.
The problem of extraction, that, even when we grant the internal self-sufficiency of the city, there's the necessity in Plato's presentation of the extraction from the outside.
Right.
And then in Aristotle's presentation of an extraction from the inside.
War inside, the slaves, yep.
Because if it's a limited final end for man, then some men are going to get more of the limited final end than others here, right?
I actually think sometimes I think the problem is really, really simple and a matter of common sense. that an effect can exceed its cause, right? And so if perfection is achievable within the city, then we have this idea that like something that's imperfect is becoming perfect. Well, that would seem, if it was self-sufficient, that would seem to suggest that the effect is exceeding the cause.
Oh, right.
Right? Like, how does something that's imperfect become perfect on its own? And it doesn't make sense. I think it fails philosophically. And so this is the reason why they always end up trying to figure out, well, where do we get the surplus? Where do we get that which isn't from us, but is from somewhere else that allows us to build something bigger than ourselves?
Oh, wow.
And so war of some sort, right? If you're closed downward, then I have to extract it from something around me that's not me. So I either am extracting it from foreign cities or I'm extracting it from my slave populations. But I'm attempting to find that cause that allows me to have the greater effect from within.
Yes. To achieve a grander happiness and material.
How would you become more happy than you are if all that exists is you?
Yeah, right.
Right. Where would it come from?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Okay. So this is the problem. And so I think this is the problem that you see with someone like Hobbes. He produces a science of it where he wants the whole politics, all of politics, just to be this big kind of swirling perpetual motion that never actually achieves any sort of end. It's just violence and pushing one thing, pushing on the other thing endlessly. You have the problem, the solution that, like we said, of Plato and Aristotle and the others who are attempting to change what they mean by the end or how it's achieved. So with Aristotle, for example, well, when we say the human end is happiness, okay, but how could we move from imperfect to perfect within ourselves, our own self-sufficiency? Well, you can't really do that unless what you mean by the self-sufficient thing is not that every piece within it achieves the end, but now it's ordered towards one man or one segment of the population achieving the end, and then that's the end of the whole. So the end of the whole is like it's one sort of one body or one organism has an end, and that end is the perfection of the statesman. So then we can have the rest of the body not achieving that end, right? And doing the best it can, which is merely to be an instrument for the achievement of the end, which is the slavery all the way down situation, right? Those are the problems they find themselves in. And what Thomas, I mean, we're going to talk about Thomas here, but we're really talking about the Christian tradition as a whole. So when we say Thomas says this or Thomas says that, it's not necessarily the case that Thomas comes up with this. Most of it is deep in the tradition. Is that Thomas's solution, or the Christian solution, the Christian insight, is to realize that God's rule or God's intervention is surplus from the beginning and surplus all the way through. Like all the way through, right? Like that the surplus touches every piece, right? The surplus isn't extracted from one place and then through some mechanism of power shifting or economic distribution or something is distributed in certain ways, but the surplus it emerges and touches every component of the city.
Right. Wow.
Right, which is the divine gift, right? Grace, grace, revelation, the divine law, ultimately.
Yeah, so the problem of where to extract surplus, and you keep having a scarcity within that you're trying to extract from the outside. And one of the insight, like you're saying here, is that God is infinite, and what he has revealed himself to be is a God who bestows grace upon grace. That it's overflowing both in the creation itself of a bestowing of the natures, but also of bringing them to their perfections, that it's grace all the way through. And he has it's, if we're using the analogy here, infinite surplus, like his being, he never runs out. Right?
Yeah, right. And the brilliance here is it's not like you're talking about some sort of magic trick. Okay, so we're not talking about the world is as Aristotle describes it, and then there's this other thing that comes along, which is God, who then gives us this extra stuff that comes from outside, and then we solve our problem. Voila, right? Like it's a magic trick. The actual argument is, the actual conception is that the cosmos itself The cosmos itself is a creation of the divine governor, the creator. And so it itself bears him in it. So what I mean is that the idea that this is what Thomas refers to as the eternal law, right? That you have that God is like a craftsman who crafts the cosmos, and the craftsman has an exemplar in his mind. Imagine like an architect with a home or a potter with a pot. These are the sorts of examples that are used. That there's an exemplar in his mind, and then he constructs the thing that is an image of the exemplar. Right, so this is the analogy that's then used to God's creation of the cosmos. That there's these divine ideas that God has an exemplar of the things He's going to build or construct, and then when he produces them, then it's an image, just like how the pot is an image of the potter and the mode of a pot. The things of creation are images of the divine in their various modes. Right, like the tree images the divine in the manner that trees do. The rock does in the manner that a rock does in the different modes. But this provides the world itself then, if the divine ideas, and this is rather complicated metaphysically, but it's interesting and somewhat mysterious. If the divine ideas are really God thinking himself in different modes. Do you see what I'm like thinking about himself in different modes, so that the creation of the things bear the image of the divine, and they bear that image in a way that is itself not closed. So because God is infinite, so the image, the things themselves, their natures, have this openness to them. You see, like the idea that lies behind the things of creation is itself endless or bottomless. Like you never, like Thomas says, you'll never know the nature of a single gnat, right? Like you could never exhaust the nature of anything. So that surplus then that we're talking about it's not some magic trick that you have a world like the way the pagans would think of it, and then there's something that kind of beams down. Yes. But that openness or that surplus is in it itself, in the cosmic order itself.
Oh, okay, right.
Okay. Do you see?
From the nature of the thing that God created it in the divine idea of the thing, that it has an infinite depth to it based on, in the image of God, He created them. It's like what you're saying is that this is a reflection of something that came before that is so much grander and deeper. Right?
Yeah. So Plato talks about the world as a moving image of the eternal, right? And this is right. Like Plato has these insights, right? And that the Christian then understanding is that, the world is a moving image of the eternal, right? The eternal or the infinite. And so there is a openness behind it, right? So human beings come to experience the world. We come to articulate what is around us. We have the ability to understand it to a certain extent, which is a whole nother situation that we should talk about, reason itself. But that is not ever exhaustive of it, right? So it's always our representations of the world, our discussion of it, our linguistic formulation of a coherent sort of understanding of what things are and how they work together is always analogical, right? It's always an analogy of what is in fact there, right? It's never actually a univocal one-to-one sort of correspondence, and that provides this sort of endless openness to the world. Like so that if we think of human rationality as the ability to perceive the universal behind the particular, but that universal ultimately is a divine idea. So you're not perceiving it and then possessing it, right? You're perceiving it as like an echo or an analogical draw of that universal that lays beyond the particular, as some beckoning you into it. Yeah. But that universal itself is endless and bottomless. And what that allows is for reason to operate as this ecstatic, creative participation in the world, that the human being who now perceives the universal behind the particular has no bottom to it himself. Like the human being, his movement, his rational movement deeper into the truth and deeper into goodness itself is this movement towards the divine, which then has no end, no bottom. So the human end is this supernatural communion with the divine, but that is always pushing further away.
Totally.
Right? So in a sense, the human end is no end at all. Like it never terminates. Even the beatific vision is just the reception of ever more of the divine.
Ever more ecstatic movements.
Right.
It reminds me of what the psalmist says, that all things speak to me of you, right? Of God, that what you see in creation, what you see in yourself, what you see in being is moving you onward to being into God,
being itself,
and by levels of participation upwards. That it's always, and this is true in the natural sphere as well, right? Like what we're saying as well at the pagan cosmos is that it's not the real cosmos too.
That's right,
right? Like it's a mistake, and so St. Paul calls this. For the pagans and Romans, because he says those things which they should have known about God's divine providence. And what he means by that is seeing that everything is ordered according to some pattern and some law speaks to you of a lawgiver, and it speaks to you of something behind all of the ordering of the universe. And so that is what the pagans should have known, but it was a kind of it was them making a kind of man-made world that gave us the pagan closed world.
Yeah, see, I mean, it's really fascinating, because if our knowledge of the world is analogical, the true knowledge, so we never possess truth in of itself, right? We're always participating in truth, which means our formulations are always analogical. Then if it's when we are in fact participating in truth, and so we are in fact living in an analogical world, right? But that is analogical of the prime analogate of God, right? It is an actual analogy. Then that analogy has a certain coherence to it, like it fits together, it works because it is an analogy of the prime analogate. And what that opens up is the possibility of the error of treating the analogy as the prime analogate. Do you see that the error of treating the man-made formulation, the man-made understanding, as if it is the understanding itself, it is as if it is truth itself, yes. And that there's a certain plausibility to it, right? Because the analog works, right? Like, okay, so but if you do that, what you've done is close that world down. Do you see now that particular human construction now is to be treated as if it's the eternal law, as if it's the divine, right? Which is what we were talking about, like with Plato, the construction of the myths, the construction of the divinity that is the lawgiver, but really the law is the law of the city, and really the lawgivers were just the guardians, but then we're going to treat them like gods, right? Like, because you see what I mean? You're treating an imperfect analogy as if it is the prime analogate itself. That's shutting reason down. Yeah. Now reason operates only underneath that cosmos, that man-made cosmos, right? And can't break out of it. And
you're putting God within it, right? Like
right. God comes within it, right?
God.
Well,
now
really, man is God.
Right. He masquerades as God to his other men.
Yeah. I mean, this is when you think about Genesis talking about the knowledge of good and evil and that sort of thing, it works here. The knowledge, we always have a knowledge of good and evil even before the fall, but that knowledge is not to be confused with good and evil itself, right? That knowledge is an analogical participation in good and evil itself. So the knowledge of good and evil is to assert my participation in good and evil is good and evil, to be like God. Right. So now you're going to build a closed human world, which is going to fail.
Yes. And interestingly here, it works for a time, right? Like, yeah. Part of it is, as you're saying, is because the analogy actually is true, that the movements upwards are true. But when you start to close it down, it'll work for a time because those analogies still remain. That they're still, but they've been capped.
I'm telling you, I know this seems like silly in some ways, the simple analogy of the cause and effect, but like if a effect can exceed its cause, it's like a little perpetual motion machine, right? You've seen them before, where like gravity feeds the water that then makes the part, these little, and they peter out.
Oh yeah, right.
Like there is a feedback loop, but what's fed back in is less than what was put in, right? You see what I mean? It doesn't produce more; it produces less every time the little machine goes around. So it peters out.
Yes.
Right, and that's the kind of thing we're talking about because there's no input.
Right.
Yeah.
And maybe we can move then to the different kinds of law and maybe Thomas's definition of law. So maybe I'll start with the different kinds of law and then the definition. So he distinguishes, we could begin with the eternal law. So like we're saying here that, so law is an ordinance of reason, Thomas will say. And the ordinance of reason is to lead something to its end. And for the whole of the cosmos, there is the eternal law. So it's both it is the creation of everything that is and the ordering of the whole thing. It's the largest, you know.
Yeah, it's a providence may be another way of talking about it. Creation, that everything is created. Everything is created imbued with these ideas that include their ends, right? As an aspect of what they're. So the idea when you create something includes what it's for, right? So it has its end built into it, and then create these things. Everything that's created, the way Thomas will describe it is that they have natural inclinations. So their nature, or the idea that animates them, has within it orientations towards their end. And so they have that, and that's what they experience as the natural inclinations. So like animals have natural inclinations towards their ends, and those natural inclinations are a sort of law, right? Like the eternal law, the manner in which, say, an animal participates in the eternal law, the way in which it participates in the eternal law is through its natural inclinations, wherein it by fulfilling those natural inclinations, it obeys God, right? That's God's command to it, and so those are its natural laws. So when you go from eternal law to natural law, eternal law is the law for the whole, the plan of the whole. Then every piece of the whole participates in that eternal law according to its natural law, according to the way in which its nature participates in the whole. Right? And so then you have natural law flowing out of eternal law as the manner in which things participate in that eternal law. Right?
Yes.
Okay. So you can see natural law and eternal law are different ways of talking about the same thing. Okay,
maybe
like
just different degrees.
Yeah, or different levels of specificity. Like you're looking at a particular thing now, and you can see the eternal law in it, or its participation in eternal law, which we then call the natural law. Right. Okay. So you have natural inclinations and things. Now the really interesting move then is when you start talking about human beings, right? Because our nature is to be rational, to be spiritual. So spiritual and rational is synonyms here, which is not the case with any of the other creatures. All right. So what that we share things with the other creatures, like we share, say, like digestion with animals and even plants. Like we grow, and that's not up to us. We can't help it. Our heart beats and we can't control it. Right? There's aspects of us that are just behaving according to the eternal law, in the same sort of way that plants and animals obey the eternal law. We have those in us, but those aren't what's properly human. Right? What's properly human is the rational. So it's human as such. And that is different because we then participate in the eternal law as rational. Okay, so and that immediately poses a sort of problem. Well, what does that look like? What does it look like to participate? So God's end or plan for us, who we are, is we're in our natures, we move towards that end, but our nature is to be rational. So that means that the movement towards that end is going to be rational rather than instinctual or just based on sort of pre-instinctual movements. Yeah,
that you just achieve it naturally inclined. We're actually reasoning our way through to our end as well.
Yeah, I mean, what it means is this is why the move for the natural law for human beings then is this is why we move directly from the natural law into the human law. All right, because for Thomas, so the human law, the way he'll describe it is he'll describe it as the specification or the determination of the natural law. But if you think about those very words, the specification, like species, right? The specification of the natural law. Well, if you think about ideas, like the example I'll sometimes give my students is like the concept of animal, that idea, that universal concept of animal. And then, but in our own minds, we can't actually imagine animal. You know, like if we try to think of animal, we always end up thinking of specific animals.
Yeah, right.
Right. We always end up, and even if we kind of like combine hippopotamus with duck or whatever, we come up with these like monsters, but they're still particular monsters, right? Like we can't imagine just animal. Do you see what I mean? Like we always have a specification of that, right? And that's actually the way reason operates. So if you're going to participate in that universal eternal law in a rational way, okay, then the specification of that is actually that participation. So that specification in the human law. So we have natural. What Thomas will say is like, okay, we have sort of certain natural inclinations, just like animals do or anything else. And he goes, okay, so what are those natural inclinations? Like, well, the example he gives is one of them is to live in community. Right. Another natural inclination is to know the truth. He says, okay, so we have these sort of natural inclinations. But unlike our heart beating or digestion, the way in which we do that, the way in which we come to learn the truth, the way in which we live in community is not predetermined by our biological constitution. Do you see what I'm saying? So
yeah,
we will have these things, but then the specification of how it is that we do it is determined by our own rationality, which Thomas refers to as a participation in providence. So we are constructing a world that's like how providence constructs the cosmos, because we're participating in reason. We're participating in the divine reason in a special way. And so the world we then construct is the world of human law, right? Human construction, but that is the way in which the natural law is lived, is manifested. There's no other way for a rational participation in the eternal law other than the construction of human law.
So the natural law for us is to build human law.
Right, it's to build worlds.
It's to build worlds. And because we participate in reason, we do it in a similar providential manner as God creating the cosmos.
That's right.
In our mode, right? We're not creating the cosmos, but
we're creating a finite world, and it's an analogous, like I was saying, it's an analogous image of the cosmic whole, right? So a microcosm, but an analogous one. And so you have, so the specification then, can be, there's examples that we can give that make it easy to understand, even if we then need to make it more complex in order to really get to it. But if you think about, say, the examples Thomas will give are things like the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments, as formulated, are a pretty general articulation of the natural law, natural moral law. So, what he means is the natural inclinations in man lead to pretty quickly the formulation of propositions like I ought not to steal from my neighbor. I ought to honor my mother and father. These sorts of propositions flow out of those natural inclinations that we have. But then if you look at them and go, okay, honor your mother and father. How? You get in the same problem that we got with animal. Like if we try to imagine an animal, we always end up imagining particular animals. Similarly, if we try to imagine honor your mother and father, you always end up imagining ways of doing it.
Yeah, take out the trash or something.
Yeah, there's things, very specific memories. And what we'll do sometimes, I'll ask my students, honor your mother and father. What does that mean? Think about that. And then they'll try to explain it back to me, having abstracted generalities out. And I'm like, no. I want to know what you're actually thinking of. I don't want you to now extract general principles out of the thing you're actually thinking of. I want you to tell me what you're actually thinking of. Yeah. And what they're actually thinking of, there's things like that. My dad lectures me and I listen to him and don't argue. My mom does this. I get her flowers on Mother's Day. My mom, these things that I actually do. And that's the human law. But the human law is the way in which the natural law is in fact encountered and in fact lived. And there's no other way. We can't. Right. There's no other way for it to be, other than through those specifications.
That's a great way to just understand the rationality or how reason works here. Is because when you're thinking, all right, honor my mother and father, or any of the other commandments, you're immediately making it particular and using prudence to decide this would be a good act to do based on this prior principle, and that's how Thomas sets up the natural law being from the first principle of do good and avoid evil. And then further specifications when in human law we're trying to apply all of those principles to a particular situation. That is what we do with reason.
Yeah, that's right. And the real move, or the deeper understanding, I think, is to understand that we can't formulate propositions at all without specifying. So in the very linguistic formulation of honor your mother and father, there's human specification in the very meaning of those words, the very context, like we are making very general precepts there, or very general specifications. But just by formulating it into human language, we're already engaged in human law.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Okay. So we're already bringing down into our world so we have an inclination that then, so the way Thomas, and this is kind of weird, I guess, but the way he'll describe it is that you have these, because we're rational, that even the natural inclinations that we have, so which is, you think about as mainly concerning the will, like we have natural desires, natural inclinations, that because we're rational, those natural inclinations are always already and always immediately accompanied by the intellectual reasons, right? We don't act on these things because they're not instinctual to us. But we have an inclination to it. We don't act upon them without providing the justification for why. Okay, so in our action we produce propositions. Do you see it? In our inclinations we produce the relevant propositions, and that's not wrong, because the relevant propositions are the intellectual side of the participation in the eternal law in that manner, right? So, but those articulations are already finite. Do you see it? Like they're already a specification or a determination of what the natural law in fact is. So we're already we're already legislating, basically, is the point.
And based on, we have natural inclinations towards certain things, and those present themselves to our mind as in propositional form of, why am I inclined to this?
It's good for me to be, it's good. I perceive it as good, right?
And that's the most essential. And then I perceive it as good, and then
I ought to do the good.
I ought to do this based on the inclination that then formulates proposition.
Yeah.
And then you can have further and further specifications of those principles based on inclinations.
Exactly.
And this fits his theory of, obviously the same theory of virtue, because in specifying the propositions and then habituating certain acts, you are becoming more like, you're perfecting that movement, right? Like you're developing the habit.
It's true, but it only works. This is why you have to move directly into the divine law. And this is exactly the sequence that Thomas gives us, right? The eternal law, the natural law, the human law, the divine law. Because the inclinations to the specification that now gives us the propositions we need for practical reasoning, Thomas will say, okay, so now we can reason practically, and which means we can come to new conclusions based on propositions that we formulated. Okay, but aren't we in the same problem where these are all derived, anything is just sort of derived directly through deduction from natural inclinations? How do we move past those, right, into a higher level of perfection? And it's like, well, the reason is because it's not under our own steam. What I mean is that reason is not merely an articulation of that which is otherwise stable and right in front of us, but reason is that movement, that ecstatic movement into that which lays beyond. Okay, so when we have natural inclinations and then formulate rationality, reasons for those reasons are not reductive of the inclination, but surpass the inclination, because we move into a deeper. We're capable of moving into a truth that is greater than the sort of input that the world gives us. We're capable of seeing into the universal, right? But this doesn't make sense. I mean, the reason why this makes sense is because our participation in the divine mind, right? Our participation in divine reason is a ongoing receptive participation. So we are receiving help, so to speak. Like we're receiving. The deep tradition will refer to it as illumination, which makes some people really mad, because they are imagining it as like a magic, like a magic trick, like a
magic wand.
Yeah. But that's not what's going on at all. Is that it's a participate or a help from within the human mind itself. Like that the human mind has these potentialities, the potential. Its potency is greater than the agents that are activating it, and so you have an agency that's greater than the world that's activating more of the potentiality or the potencies, and that agency is God. Okay, so you have so reason itself then is this participation in the life of the divine, and is a receptivity to his action. And the way Thomas will describe this is that there's a submission to the divine, a submission to the divine that enables reason to be itself. So there's this like seeming paradox where the unbelievable dignity and ambition of human world, of our construction of worlds, is prerequisite to it, or integral to it, is this humble reception from beyond, from above, from the divine. Do you see? Okay, so you brought up virtue, and this is important because if we you can imagine this as sort of like a feedback loop, sort of loops, and if we are moving into our inclinations, formulating propositions which are allowing us to act further, right? But every time we're pushing deeper in, further into truth, further into reality, we're moving in that regard. Then our habituation, the habituation into that movement, which is virtue, that the virtues are not themselves merely a habituation of the resources that we brought to bear, but the virtue itself is moving past the action that creates it. Do you see? Okay.
Yep.
And so therefore creating second natures, that Thomas will call them, or further inclinations that then enable our reason to work even better, right? Okay. That's grace, that there's grace then operative in the movement of ourselves past the kind of just circular spinning of the wheels if we had a closed nature.
Yeah, this goes back to your cause and effect.
Yeah, so you have this movement that's surpassing the movement. And that's that ecstatic, the like being drawn deeper in. And the receptivity of that, our active ambition is completely tied to the receptivity of that, the passive receptivity of that which is greater than us. So the divine law for Thomas is this combination of grace. It's grace ultimately, but it's grace with an intellectual component to it. And so it's because our wills and our intellects are we talk about those as separate, but that's only so we can understand it. They're actually one thing, right? And so that movement into virtue then is a movement into the movement that creates an ever more perfect world. Do you see what I mean? Like the human law that we're formulating leads us into virtue, which then leads us to be able to create ever more perfect human law, leading us ever deeper into virtue, ever more perfect law, ever deeper. And that whole movement is a movement deeper into the divine ideas that underwrite reality, which is the rendering of our world an ever more perfect image of the divine. In other words, an ever more beautiful world, right? That we're moving into the truth that we're talking about the transcendentals here, and that movement of truth and goodness, that dynamism is revealing beauty, right? And the beauty is that mysterious, ever further beyond that draws you deeper in, right?
Yes.
And so the world we're constructing an ever more beautiful world that's tied up with our movement into perfection and virtue, which is the creation of human law, which is the specification of the natural law, which is the rational participation in the eternal law. Do you see, like, there's
moving all the way,
and that's the realization of the divine will. You see, like, the eternal law, the divine providence, which is then realized in human nature through our participation in providence itself. Right. This is what that means then is the divine law is not added, super added. It's not like we can formulate this eternal law, natural law, human law system and then go, and then no, right. Because we have the supernatural end, we get the divine law kind of tacked on top, which would enable someone to say, how about I just don't have the divine law and just live in this philosophical part.
No. It was intended all the way.
It's like, no. From the very beginning, the natural law or the divine law was an aspect of our creation from the very beginning because our end surpasses our nature. So there was no way. I mean, like, our end surpasses our nature, unlike any of the other creatures, right? So that means that we have to have this perpetual receptivity from that which is higher than us.
Yeah, God's present as agent in every one of those steps. You know, when man is making,
right.
He's present in the creating of the nature of the thing and in the forming of the inclinations, in the participation and rationality in the movement into something grander, because if it's just a kind of internal machinery, it doesn't work. And then he's present in the divine law and bringing man to his final end. And so there's not a closed natural system thing going on here.
No, far from it. I know that I don't think that's right. But you see what we've done with politics here, because where are politics? Have we sidestepped politics? Have we destroyed politics? Have we said we don't need politics? It's like, no. The whole system of the creation of the human law, which is the formulation of worlds that are relative, that have relative justice, relative virtue, right? Like, we have justice, like Plato would say. We have temperance, we have fortitude, we have courage, but none of them are courage itself. That's God. None of it is fortitude itself, justice itself. That's the transcendent. So that whole problem of the conventional versus the natural or the absolute, right, is being brought into this understanding that the conventional is not only conventional, it's also the only manner in which the absolute is ever experienced.
Right. This isn't an either or of relative
yeah,
or absolute
the absolute
justice.
is experienced as the conventional. So the whole political world then of the creation of law, the creation of different laws, like you think about the nature of analogy, that even if we have true analogical representations of the divine, right, true worlds, that the offset between the finite human construction and the infinite divine is infinite. Okay, so what that means is that there's no limit to the number of different analogical worlds we could construct. There's an infinitely variable understanding of truth here. So what that means is that you could have the whole insight of what one city has this justice, another city has this justice, another city. It's like, yeah, like that itself. Yep, you're seeing the way convention works. You're seeing the way human law works. That's right. But that doesn't relativize it. It relativizes it in a human sense, but doesn't have to lead to relativism, to the idea that therefore there is no transcendent justice. That's the concept of the analogy of being that underwrites Christian metaphysics makes it so we don't have to make that move. Okay, so now politics is truly a human construction. It's truly human power. It's truly habituating people into the law. Virtue is tied to law, which is what Aristotle says, right? Virtue and Plato. The law, which is that if you want to look at it in a sort of formal sense, that propositional formulation of the world that we're building is then inculcated into the people through habitual action, which then creates the virtues that are elevating them into their perfection. This is not a repudiation of a ancient understanding of how the Platonic Aristotelian understanding, but a fulfillment of it, of a seeing it and then saying, and look, it can work, right?
Yes, it's not a politics is now done with, and it's just the grace stuff, and we just get saved at the end of this whole politics thing. It brings it back, and that the necessity. So he begins the Summa with the insight of the necessity of sacred doctrine for philosophy, whether besides philosophy any sacred doctrine is needed, and he says yes, right. there is the need for sacred doctrine, the knowledge of the final end. But then in a kind of similar way, what's the necessity of the divine law? Well, the necessity of the divine law is all the way through to bring man to his final end, because again, he can't achieve that final end on his own. And so that divine law is bringing him to that greater participation. And I think now is probably a good time to bring in sin and how sin messes this whole thing up.
Before we do that, there's one more thing that we talked about with Aristotle that I feel like maybe it would be good to bring up. Remember when we were talking about Aristotle, we talked about how the way he attempts to solve the problem is by having the human end be achieved by just one or a limited group of people, right? And then understanding the society as this corporate thing that's ordered towards their perfection, right? Okay, but how has Thomas changed that, right? And this is important, right? Because what's happened is that the different offices within the city, or the different roles within the city, are not in Thomas's understanding that the final end surpasses the city. The final end is happiness, which is the beatific vision, and what that means is that we don't have to figure out who gets it in the city, right? Do you see what? Okay, so it's pushed beyond, but not. And I'll try to just say it simply, even if it's not clear why I would say this. But what happens is that now each part of the whole is aimed at an end that surpasses the whole, but is only achievable through the completion of the city as a perfect image of itself, a perfect version of itself. Okay, so the living of the human law, right, which is the way in which the natural law is experienced, which is the participation in the eternal law, which is the different modes of being within the city. So different offices within the city have different orientations towards that law, different modes. In the same sort of way that when God creates the cosmos, there's rocks and trees and dogs, and they're all different modes of the divine idea. Similarly, the different people within the city are living in different modes or different ways of being oriented towards that human law, right? But it need not be the case that any one is more perfect or less perfect than the other. They're different ways. A tree is different than a dog, right? There's the bricklayer is different than the architect, right? But they're different modes of an orientation towards a whole whose end must not be located within it, but surpasses it. What I mean is, what I'm trying to get at is that the fulfillment of the city is encountered in the fulfillment of every part. So each part is a whole in its own right? Each part, the divine law then, so if we think about divine law as grace, that it doesn't touch, it's not like you have the Aristotelian city and then you're going to have grace flowing at the top.
From the top down.
Top down. The divine impulse, the divine surplus is touching every piece, right? Every piece. And so this is the reason why the medievals will use the analogy of the soul and the body, right? That the soul, where is the soul? What part of the body is it in? And it's like, well, the soul is the form of the whole body. It's the soul. It's the form of the finger. It's the form of the head. It's the form. It permeates the entire thing. It's not a motor, Thomas says, that you could locate someplace. Yeah. Right? It's the animation of the whole thing. And so if that's the case, then we get rid of the necessity for or even the idea of sort of natural slaves or humans as instruments to other people, or humans who are sort of consigned to a lesser fulfillment, or no, like every member of the whole has the end of the whole within reach. That's the move that then eliminates the whole master-slave dichotomy and allows for the idea that so if you think about, if you look at the pagans in what we were discussing, it seems like they find themselves in a situation where they have to find themselves with sort of gods in the city, men as gods. Plato does the same thing, the Guardians, right? Aristotle does the same thing. And then men as lesser than men, slaves, animals, right? And that the difference between them, Aristotle actually says this, the distance between them is as great as man to beast. Man to beast. So in order to make this thing work, we have to have men greater than men, gods. We have to have men lesser than men, slaves, right? And then we can kind of make it work. But what we're doing here with Thomas is it's like, well, you still kind of have those two things, but you're bringing them together, and you're saying every man is greater than a man, because every man in our very rational nature is being drawn out and beyond our nature into the supernatural. We're being pulled into the divinity. So we ourselves are divine. I mean, participating in the divine. Everyone is. And then also that only is possible because of our receptivity, our humility, our receiving and then our obedience to the divine law. So we're also all slaves of a sort, right? Like the obeying of the command and the deification are combined. And so the problem, that slave God man, slave man thing, it's not just swept away. It's like, yeah, there was something to that. Right. And yet what's been revealed in Christianity is what it is, right? What it is. We are greater than humans, and we are lesser in some, lesser than gods.
Yeah. So just to illustrate it again. So the pagan, you got your bottom class craftsmen, tradesmen and farmers, in the Aristotelian, and then you got your notables, and then you have the one statesman, and all of the power is moving. All of the resources and the obeying is moving upwards, right? Like, right. It's coming from the top and it's going, But with the divine law, then it's even at what you're saying here is that at every point within the structure there is a movement towards God, and that there is,
in order for it to be itself, it must transcend the city. Right? Like, in order for the bricklayer to be most perfectly the bricklayer, he must see in the clay more than what's there. Right? His rationality, he must be moving into creativity, which is the movement into virtue, which is the construction of ever better human law in the mode of a bricklayer. Like, the part of the city that governs bricklaying, he's legislating and creating ever better specifications of the natural law through his reason into his movement into virtue, and that's the same of everybody. So it's like, this is like when Aristotle says, right, in the perfect city, right, everyone is both a ruler and ruled, right? The citizens both rule and are ruled. It's like, yeah, and within this understanding of ecstatic rationality, in the creation of human law as the fulfillment of the natural law, it becomes the case that everyone is in fact both ruler and ruled. Everyone is in fact a legislator. And not just because they're like taking turns, but because in their very vocation within the city, they're legislating. Do you see? Like, they're specifying the natural law in their rationality, which is contingent on their obedience to the divine law.
Right. And I want to emphasize a side of it, because you brought up the humility part of it, right? That when you're becoming co-creating and you're participating in this divine law, that it's, of course, it's imperfect still, right? And it's not as though it works perfectly. And so, the constant call of repentance and the humility that it is God working, and also that we are working.
Well, there's a certain pain to it even. So, and this is even without introducing sin, there's a certain dying to yourself. So when you formulate analogical representations of truth, okay, those appear to you as truth. Okay, so you think of like a child. right? A child who a little kid, like a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, who has an idea of who God is, and that idea is, you know, imperfect, but not untruthful. I mean, their idea of God is like a kind, wise man, you know.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, and it's not wrong. It's just not a very good analogy, right? But as they grow, but it's analogical. As they grow, and at some point they have to move past that childish analogy, right? And make move into a more complicated, a more subtle, a more sophisticated analogy, and ultimately a more beautiful one. But in doing that, there's a sort of death to self. Do you see what I'm saying? Like there's a sort of like even sadness in having to set aside the thing you used to think as a child. And we've experienced this, haven't we? When you realize, oh, it's time to, and you in virtue, you're happy to do so, and it's actually a moment of joy to have moved deeper in. But there's still a sort of
a humiliation.
A sort of humiliation.
You weren't there already.
Yeah, exactly. And a sort of realization, you know, and I think that self-transcendence then always has within it a sort of a humility. Like to transcend yourself, you have to look at yourself with disdain's not the right word, because that has a
we experience it with the podcast.
But you know what I mean?
You watch old podcasts
with a sort of almost embarrassment.
Sure,
right, and that so there even without sin, there's a sort of sacrifice of self, right, in that movement deeper in.
Yeah, and it's both. I love that it's the joy and humility, because it's joy that you're moving closer, but it's also the humility to recognize you weren't already at your perfection and knowledge and, and everything at the same time. And it allows for genuine creativity. And
absolutely, that's what creativity is.
Yeah, and freedom. Really,
freedom.
Like what we're saying is this is what makes you most free, is to be participating in something in God, in your participation in God and your particular mode and level, and moving deeper into participation, and that there is the assertion of dependence on others to lead you to that. This is the reason why you can be ruler and ruled, because there are those who are deeper in wisdom and knowledge and virtue and whatever who
there's
help
even
us to lead us further into it.
So virtue itself, like you said, is prerequisite on that there are those who lead us deeper into it. But then there's also the humility of being led. So like the bricklayer and the architect's a good example, right? The bricklayer who could be a total master and therefore be rational and legislating and moving deeper into the truth of clay and bricks and heat, like, right? And be a ruler in his world, is at the same time that place where that mode that he's living requires a obedience to the architect who's designing the buildings. Right, and the bricklayer doesn't get to draw the architect into his legislation, right? His legislation, his world is his rationality and movement into virtue and perfection has this higher authority that he obeys as a part of that movement. But that's true of everyone. Like there's no one. That's the idea. One of the realizations is there is no top guy. Right? Like the top guy himself at the very, very top has to become the holiest of all men, which means the one who obeys the divine command from top to bottom.
Totally. This is the reason why the Pope's title,
the servant of the servants of God.
From Gregory, Pope Gregory is the servant of the servants of God. That actually, and this is the greatest of you shall be like the least. Yeah. That what that means is when you're at the highest level, it's not the powers being served totally to you. This is, and Plato and Aristotle see this, that power is meant for the common good. It's
the whole idea of the whole notion of the philosopher king is grasping after this.
But they can't see how it all would work. Right. How would it all work that you could have a servant of the servants? It seems like it necessitates having a master who's master over the world. But the
irony of the thing I want to say is that servant of the servants, this is where like we want to just say no to Nietzsche, right? He's the most free. I mean, he like his service is a service in creative rationality, Like what he is doing is pushing deeper in to the beauty, further into the divine idea, right? Into just total freedom. Do you see what it's not that the dichotomy between service and power is wrong. Okay, like that's not the way power works, right? Because of the very constitution of the cosmos itself is what I'm trying to assert.
Because that the nature of power, if you have greater power and your power ultimately you yourself are moving towards God and dependent on him for the fulfillment of your end, then the power and the human law that you specify for those under your care and under your rule is leading them to an end beyond your own power.
Absolutely right. Yeah,
serving them in their movement towards.
But that's where you have the most efficacy, like your will. You see, I mean, that's the thing. It's like it. Yeah, I mean, freedom is not just a sort of subjective experience, but freedom is the phenomenon of living in a world that is open to your action, right? Mm-hmm. That is open to the efficacy of your will, like that is open to it. And so the opening up of the world is a prerequisite, is integral component to what we mean by freedom. So that opening of the world is exactly what like the common good of the city is achieving. Do you see what I mean? Like the common good of the city is the ever opening of a world. Mm-hmm. And so to be ever more free is to not work against the common good of the city, right? That would be attempting to close it down, but rather to live in it and to move it further. Mm-hmm. So your act of freedom of moving into an ever greater, ever more open world is an act of service to the city, which is the context within which that world is being built, right? Okay, and to work against that is to actually enslave yourself. That's that. I guess I hope that makes some degree of sense, but that's what I'm trying to get at. Yeah.
You're more free with friends who are moving towards that final end with you. That's what the city.
But the city,
is supposed to be.
Like we go back from the beginning, the city, the social thing is the only context in which the eternal law is participated in by the natural law through the creation of human law, which is the creation of a human world in which we live coherently, right? So you can't break out of that and be free. To break out of that is to become ultimately servile.
Yes. Right.
Okay, so that's where that kind of Nietzschean opposition fails. You see what I'm trying to say? Mm-hmm.
It's trying to invert it and think it'll work again, being master over slaves.
It doesn't work.
It doesn't work. It's like, no, you're going to be enslaved to the slaves.
It doesn't work.
We're down through We're down through it again.
It's a pipe dream.
Right.
I mean, it is the original pipe dream, right? It's the original. You wanted to introduce sin. It's the original, you will be like gods, having the knowledge of good and evil, meaning possessing it, being the source of it, right? But to be the source of good and evil rather than to be a participant in good and evil, like we've been talking about, is to take your analogical articulation of good, evil, true, and false and treat it as if it's the eternal law, to treat it as if it's the divine idea. Well, that just shut down freedom. Like now, if you're going to do that, now move all rationality instead of having no end to the universal, no like sort of backstop or cap to the thoughts that we can have. Now we've made an analogical world, an analogical representation of the divine. We've made it the divine, right? So now all our rationality has to operate beneath that, and it still sort of does. Right, like the universal still still is capable of a whole lot of specification, a lot of determinations. There's movement that can occur within the man-made concept, but not infinitely. Now closed down.
Yeah, and isn't the insight that the tyrant is the most miserable in the city? That the person who is really the source of good and evil is actually the most miserable.
Yeah, right.
Because the people who participate in that that legislature's good and evil, they're not perfectly conformed to that, because if they were, they would be totally closed off to the divine law, and it would be just total slavery or tyranny.
You would hardly even know what their motivation would be if they were total. Yeah.
And so the person who actually gets to be beyond good and evil, who gets to be the constructor of the world and all this stuff, he is necessarily the most miserable one of all of them, and feels
the most enslaved. Right. I mean, has the least amount of freedom.
Yeah, right. Least freedom. Because they're participating in his good and evil, but he can't actually have friendship and something beyond both of them, because it all comes from him.
Right.
And so you're stuck in it.
So when we introduce sin, what happens in the fall is that ultimately, I guess a way of articulating it might be to treat human law as if it's the eternal law. So what Thomas says is that what the sin is the cutting off of submission to the divine law. Okay, obedience to divine law. And what Thomas says, it's really interesting. He says, what was the sin of Eve? And people, the way he describes it is that she was ambitious for a greater excellence than a greater excellence. I don't remember the exact words, but something to the effect of a greater excellence than was her condition, and had a curiosity for a greater understanding than was her position. Right. So what his point is that it's the lack of the humility, but it's again coupled with this phenomenal human dignity and ambition, right? The excellence. It's not wrong to pursue excellence. It's not wrong to pursue knowledge. That it was to try to leap into excellence and knowledge beyond the place where you were, right? So that's the rejection of that humble receptivity of the divine and an attempt to usurp it by jumping over, leapfrogging. Right? And what he says is that break then, so that's a break of receptivity of the divine law, then is simultaneously the end of the elevation of man into that which is beyond, and at the exact same time, in the exact same act, the wounding of nature, precisely because human nature is that which is to be elevated. Do you see what I'm saying? Like it's not self-sufficient. So it's not like you had two actions. You commit the sin, and then grace is cut off, and then you're punished, and human nature is wounded. That's not the case. Human nature, like we've been describing it, is that which is to surpass itself through receptivity to the divine law. So when the divine law is received or cut off, no longer being received, then human nature itself is less than itself. Right? It can't be what it is.
Because it's cut off from the divine law,
which is what's necessary for its perfection, for the achievement of its end. Things are identified by their ends, right? Its end is communion with the supernatural. So it's less than itself. So the wound of human nature and the cutting off of elevation to the supernatural are the same event.
Yes, totally. And it progresses so quickly, like we're already on to Cain.
Murder, which we talked about. We're
already on to murder.
When we talked about Augustine, right? The founding murder.
Yep. You've and as Augustine described it, we're bringing it back in the circle. But this initial death of the supernatural death of being cut off of the divine law, and then part of being this creator of good and evil is, even though death is to be received as a punishment for the loss of the divine law and the body no longer obeying the soul, as Augustine describes it, there is the further attempt to cut yourself from the divine law and make yourself the creator of good and evil by the founding murder in Cain.
Right, exactly.
And then the founding of the city.
To control death,
to control even the manner of your punishment as being part of your constructed law.
Right, yeah, that goes even further.
Yeah, maybe we could talk also about the Lex Fomes, or the law of concupiscence, because he gives it a level as law, somewhat. It's
imperfect. It's similar to the way the laws are for animals.
Okay. Yes. So the law of concupiscence. So this is when the natural inclinations, because you're cut off from the divine law, become corrupted. Right. So you, as St. Paul says, I see a war within my members, that there's inclinations towards animalistic inclinations that are leading you away from rationality, and if given into, actually lead you further into vice and further away from reason. And it's the satisfaction of those lower concupiscible desires that that we have I think, you know, part of that is in the creation of good and evil is to satisfy those lower desires. I mean, it's the same thing Plato's talking about with the tyrant, right? Like the tyrant is the most miserable because he's enslaved even to his lower desires.
I mean, there's you know, when we were talking about under the divine law, there's an ecstatic nature to reason and to action, and the virtues that are formed surpass the actions that form them, right? Which is something that I think sometimes is missed, right? And that's because grace is informing the formation of virtue, right? So the virtues surpass the actions that form them. When you cut that off, and so now you have natural inclinations, and you're pursuing them, and then formulating the reasons for why they're good. The reasons that you're formulating now are not greater than the action, but lesser. Do you see what I'm saying? So because you're no longer moving in that ecstatic outside and beyond. Now you're moving. You're trying to produce this internal perpetual motion machine, and so your reasoning actually declines in its ability to understand what you're doing. Okay, because every time, and the inclinations, the formation of vice is the formation of these sort of these master inclinations, these super inclinations that are in their formation destroying your ability to understand what you're doing. Right?
Oh, wow, yeah.
Okay, because of the same principle we talked about from the beginning, that an effect can't exceed the cause, right? So it's like if you're caught into this, it's a downward spiral. This is why he says it increases in each man, it increases as they act, the fomes, right? Like the law, the stimulant to sin becomes stronger and more all-encompassing as you move deeper in.
Yes.
And you become more like an animal. And how do animals behave? Animals' inclinations dominate them without the intervention of reason whatsoever. And so you become more animal-like. But what that really is the formation of an ever smaller world for man. Do you see? Like your rationality is operating in a smaller and smaller and smaller space. That's that petering out of the machine.
And that is the major, you know, that is the problem, that the Lex Fomes, corrupting human law and making it closed. And, you know, I'll bring it in here, but Paul saying the law increases sin when he's talking about the old law. And I know it's very complex, but to maybe simply that the problem of the natural inclinations, it's not as though you can just illumine man as to what he is to do after the fall, and then he just can do it. Actually, he has to have a redemption of the natural inclinations. Otherwise, he continues and perpetuates what is now presented to his reason as, well, I want to achieve this lower end, so I'm going to do these type of things. So when the old law enters in and reveals sin to man, or reveals what he is to do, the natural inclinations have not yet been affected. That is still present. And so what Paul's saying is the necessity of grace in that, right, of a redemption and the restoring of reason and the restoring of the will, so that reason can be illumined to its final end and actually achieve the final end, you know, through the participation with God. Yeah.
So there's, to just go off what you're saying there's a trap that man finds himself in. And I think I can try to explain it. Maybe I'm trying to think about how to do it. Okay. So when Thomas talks about law, you know, and he's sort of alternating between law in a sort of perfect kind of primordial state and then law and reality, right? Or in our fallen state. And it's sometimes hard to sort which one is which. But law, it has two functions, two general functions. One is to lead people deeper into virtue. So even if there were no sin, you'd have to have law, like we were talking about. that's constructing the world, and that's leading people deeper in and providing them with that knowledge that's necessary to lead deeper into virtue. So there's that aspect to law. But then when sin is introduced, you have now a remedial aspect to law, right? Because now law, the people have disordered inclinations and vices, and so the law needs to operate now within those disorders in order, like you said, there's a war between two laws. I have two laws. One aspect of me is saying has some orientation to the true good and to the natural law and the human law that's fulfilling it, and I want to do it. Then I have this other aspect of me that, say, wants pleasure or something. I don't, physical pleasures. And what human law can do is that human law can introduce punishments for the pursuit of pleasure, say, introduce punishments that produce pain. So now if you have this conflict between your two laws, and now you're looking at the pursuit of pleasure, but now the pursuit of pleasure in the circumstances you're in, this action now includes pain. Well, that doesn't look very pleasurable, right? So if you have a conflict between your laws, now your good orientation, right, your virtues such as they are, can win. Okay, and the attractiveness of the disordered one is reduced because of that. So the punishment itself doesn't lead to virtue. The punishment produces circumstances in which the inclination towards vice is less attractive, and so the inclination, the already existing inclination toward virtue, is relatively stronger. You see, okay, that feels very sort of
absolutely. That's super insightful.
So that's how virtue is formed out of law, right? Out of the remedial aspect of law. So that funnels them back into the positive aspect of law, which is the instructive side. Okay, but here's the problem: we've introduced vice here. The lawgiver, the ruler who is now performing the remedial action, the law through which he does that has to be superior to the vice in which the person he's ruling is wallowing in. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, he has to see it, understand it, and be able to legislate accordingly. So, but the vices that he has, the lawgiver has, are not available for that action. Do you see what I mean? He doesn't even perceive them as that which needs to be rectified. Right? Okay, so he doesn't, and there's no human law in a position to guide him out of the vice he's in into a higher law, back into virtue. You see what I'm saying? So if you have hierarchies of vice and virtues, people higher up can legislate remedially. But once we've broken off from the divine law and we're in this sort of downward spiral, that remedial action itself the scope of it is decreasing as the society as a whole is declining, right? Because there's no one in a position of virtue greater than the guy who happens to have the most power, right? The most virtue. So you see, you get into a trap where the laws that you would need to lead you out of your vice, the laws that you would need to move the city as a whole out of its disorder, are exactly the laws that it cannot make for itself, because it's the laws they need.
Yeah.
Right.
And the lawmakers is a part of them. So
the laws that, so you have this remedial action that becomes it itself is spinning out. Right. And this is why when Thomas talks about the age of nature after the fall, it's not this static situation where it's just like we fall and then we're wicked. He talks about it as a process of falling ever further away from the primordial justice, right? Over time, we fall away from it ever deeper into viciousness.
Yes.
And it takes time, which is interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
In Romans 5, when Paul is comparing the gift and the trespass, he says that it was through one man's trespass that the many fell, that everyone, that death entered, but it is out of many trespasses that the gift comes. And so the gift is greater.
Right.
And it's actually because sin increases, right? Like,
yeah, exactly.
We participate in Adam's fall, even if we don't do it in the same manner as Adam, because we didn't have original justice, but the trespass increases. The trespass continues to develop because of vice, because of the nature of the human in our rationality to we're perfecting the law of sin.
Right. Yeah, we get better and better at it.
It's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, right? Because our reason never, because we're human beings, our reason is never gone, right? It becomes ridiculously cramped. You know, if our end becomes, say, let's say we're misers, and so our end becomes the accumulation of wealth rather than the supernatural end. Well, now our rationality now is no longer looking for the truth behind things, but is now looking for the source of money behind everything. And so, well, yeah, you can create a sort of analogical world where, because everything is flowing out of the same prime analogate. There's a certain commonality to everything. And you know what I mean? Like you can take any measure, anything, and sort of compare it to the whole cosmos and re-articulate the cosmos in how each component relates to that finite end, because everything relates to everything. So you can do that, and you can build a world that kind of works and makes sense, but is ordered towards the accumulation of wealth. You can create ordered towards glory, ordered towards sexual pleasure, whatever, it doesn't matter, ordered towards your next hit of drugs. And you create these little worlds in which reason operates, and it can appear to you as if that's the whole world. Right? And reason sort of works in it, but it's always like we've been talking about, it's always dying. It's always in the process of going deeper into vice, failing. So the little virtues you develop in the pursuit of wealth don't hold.
Yeah.
Right?
They lead to your own destruction.
Yeah, right, in the end. And so you have this ever-increasing amount of sin.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's the condition. I think that's the way that Thomas wants to talk about what happens in the age of nature after the fall. Right? And so he says that, because he's convinced that everything that happens for a reason. And so he asks the question, well, why did God leave us in the age of nature for so long? And he says, his answer is, well, man is prideful about two things, he says. Man is prideful about his intellect and about his will, that we can know the truth and that we can do it, the good, pursue the good. And he leaves us in the age of nature, the age of the natural law, without the divine law, the natural law cut off from the divine law, in order for us to become convinced that our reason fails. You know, in order for us to not be able to find the truth. Like we descend into more and more animal-like behavior, and that there's a desperation that comes out of that, and that's the purpose of leaving us in the age of nature.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's the end of Romans 11. It's God consigned all to disobedience so that he might have mercy on all. And Paul is concerned over and over again that no man may boast before God. That man how you set it up with the humiliation and the ambition that Eve was trying to leap beyond with her ambition to something greater in this initial temptation. But, and then with the removal of the divine law, what sin reveals to man is that he can't achieve, any of his ends. Vice is destroying him. He's
frustrated everywhere.
And also that other men are also seeking that, and so he's in competition with them in war, and where this ends up is the place for repentance and humility to then call out to God for the bestowing of the divine law.
But one thing just to throw in there, just to remind everybody, is that when the tradition talks about the age of nature, which is this period between the fall and the giving of the law, the old law, that what they're talking about is the pagan world. Okay, so that's the world of the pagans. So when we were talking about pagan politics, it's and then we're seeing that they're caught in this trap and they can't find their way out, and they sort of perceive it, and it's frustrated. It's a frustration, and then it's when the tradition is talking about the age of nature, that's what they're talking about. See, so they're not denying the pagans. If anything, they're confirming the pagans' experience. Aristotle's right. Plato's right. These guys are right. That is what the world is like in the age of nature. Right? That is what it's like in that period. And then the redemption begins to occur. And then so you can see how, again, it's not a denial of the pagan insight. It's a yes and. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. And I think we should put then now that we have that all out with law and with sin, the old law and the move to the new law and grace and redemption, maybe do that in the next episode.
Let's do that in the next one.
Yeah.
And spend some time with it.
And really develop this. Yeah. This was brilliant. Yeah. Thank you, Andrew.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And so, beginning on law, and then we'll continue old law, new law, how all that we've set up here, Thomas shows us this through the different ages, the age of nature, the age of law, and then the age of grace.
Age of grace, and then glory.
And
the age of glory, yeah.
Yep.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you, everyone, for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.